The 1980s promised bigger, louder, and more spectacular cinema than ever before. Studios were spending like never before, chasing blockbusters that could rival the success of Star Wars and E.T. the Extraterrestrial. But not every gamble paid off. Some films arrived with massive budgets, A-list stars, and marketing campaigns that screamed event cinema, only to collapse within weeks. Audiences stayed home. Critics sharpened their knives, careers wobbled. In some cases, entire studios nearly sank. Yet time has a strange way of rewriting failure. A few of these so-called disasters quietly found cult followings. Others remained fascinating relics of unchecked ambition. These are the films that aimed for glory and hit financial ruin instead. You might remember the posters, you might remember the trailers, but do you remember just how hard they fell? Let's revisit 10 80s box office disasters that crashed, burned, and refused to be forgotten.
Ishtar, 1987. Few titles became punchlines as Ishtar. Starring Warren Beatty and Dustin Hoffman, two of the biggest names in Hollywood, the film was expected to dominate. Instead, stories of ballooning budgets and troubled desert shoots overshadowed the comedy itself. Directed by Elaine May, the project reportedly climbed toward $50 million, fueling media narratives of access before audiences even bought tickets. The humor, intentionally awkward and satirical, was misread as incompetence. Critics piled on, viewers stayed away. The box office returns were disastrous compared to its cost. Yet, in recent years, some critics have re-examined Ishtar as a misunderstood political satire with surprisingly sharp writing. At the time, though, perception became reality. The industry labeled it a fiasco, and that label stuck for decades. Few flops have ever carried such mythic infamy.
Krull, 1983. Krull attempted to fuse fantasy, science fiction, and epic adventure into one sweeping spectacle. Featuring early appearances by Liam Neeson and Robbie Coltrane, the film constructed massive sets and complex creature designs. Its signature weapon, the glaive, became a marketing centerpiece. Despite a substantial budget for the era, box office returns were underwhelming. Critics found the narrative derivative, comparing it unfavorably to Star Wars and other fantasy hits. Audiences seemed unsure how to categorize it. Was it medieval myth or space opera? The tonal blend confused expectations. Over time, Krull developed cult appreciation for its ambitious world-building and practical effects. But initial reception was tepid, and financial disappointment overshadowed creative risk. It stands as a reminder that genre blending requires precise balance. Without it, even imaginative universes can struggle to find an audience. Red Sonja, 1985. Capitalizing on the sword and sorcery craze sparked by Conan the Barbarian, Red Sonja aimed to launch a new fantasy icon. Starring Brigitte Nielsen alongside Arnold Schwarzenegger, the film promised epic battles and mythical spectacle. Production design delivered colorful sets and elaborate costumes, but critics criticized weak dialogue and uneven pacing. Audiences expecting the intensity of Conan found a lighter, less cohesive adventure. Box office returns disappointed relative to expectations and star power. Marketing leaned heavily on Schwarzenegger's presence, despite his supporting role, creating mismatched anticipation. Over time, Red Sonja gained modest cult status among fantasy enthusiasts, yet it never achieved franchise longevity. In the competitive mid-80s market, spectacle alone was insufficient. The film's ambition exceeded its execution, and financial results reflected that gap. It remains a fascinating relic of genre experimentation.
The Adventures of Baron Munchausen, 1988. Visionary director Terry Gilliam never aimed small, and The Adventures of Baron Munchausen proved it. A fantastical odyssey filled with giant sets, elaborate costumes, and surreal imagery, the production was plagued by studio interference and runaway expenses. Reports suggested the budget soared past $40 million, making it one of the most expensive films of its time. Distribution issues limited its release, and marketing confusion left audiences unsure what they were buying. Was it a family adventure? An art film? A satire? Critics admired its imagination, but questioned its coherence. At the box office, it collapsed. Yet visually, the film remains breathtaking. a handcrafted fantasy bursting with theatrical ambition. Gilliam's uncompromising style earned cult admiration in later years, but financial damage had already been done. It became another example of bold creativity colliding with commercial expectation. Ambition soared, revenue did not.
Heaven's Gate, 1980. When Michael Cimino was handed the keys to an epic western after winning Oscars for The Deer Hunter, the studio expected prestige gold. Instead, they received one of the most infamous financial implosions in Hollywood history. Heaven's Gate spiraled wildly over budget, ballooning toward $40 million, an astronomical sum at the time. Endless retakes, elaborate sets, and perfectionist direction pushed production into chaos. When it finally premiered, critics attacked its length and pacing, and audiences avoided it entirely. The film reportedly contributed to the collapse of United Artists, a studio once synonymous with artistic freedom. Yet decades later, reassessments have praised its haunting cinematography and operatic ambition. What was once labeled indulgent is now viewed by some as misunderstood. But in 1980, nuance didn't matter. The box office numbers were brutal, swift, and career-altering.
Howard the Duck, 1986. Years before comic book movies dominated multiplexes, Howard the Duck attempted to turn a cult Marvel character into mainstream spectacle. Produced by George Lucas, the film blended animatronics, sci-fi parody, and awkward adult humor into a tone audiences couldn't quite process. Families found it strange, adults found it childish, critics were merciless. Made for roughly $37 million, it struggled to earn back its budget and quickly became shorthand for blockbuster embarrassment. The visual effects, ambitious for their time, felt uncanny rather than charming. Even the marketing seemed confused about who the movie was actually for. Over time, nostalgia softened its reputation, and cameo appearances in later Marvel projects sparked affectionate irony. But in 1986, this talking duck represented a cautionary tale about brand power without clarity. It showed that spectacle alone could not guarantee success.
Flash Gordon, 1980. Riding the wave created by Star Wars, Flash Gordon attempted to revive a classic comic strip hero with cosmic flair. Produced by Dino De Laurentiis, the film leaned heavily into vibrant colors, theatrical performances, and a bombastic soundtrack by Queen. Its campy tone divided audiences expecting straightforward space adventure. While visually striking, the exaggerated style felt closer to operatic parody than grounded epic. Box office returns were underwhelming compared to its sizable budget, particularly in the United States. Critics debated whether it was knowingly playful or accidentally absurd. Over time, its unapologetic flamboyance gained cult appreciation, especially for its music and production design. But upon release, mainstream audiences hesitated. Competing against more serious science fiction spectacles, Flash Gordon struggled to justify its scale. It glimmered brightly, briefly, before fading commercially.
The Thing, 1982. Today, The Thing is hailed as a horror masterpiece. In 1982, it was a commercial disappointment. Directed by John Carpenter and starring Kurt Russell, the film delivered paranoia, isolation, and groundbreaking practical effects. Unfortunately, it opened the same year as E.T. the Extraterrestrial, whose hopeful alien narrative contrasted sharply with Carpenter's bleak vision. Audiences gravitated toward warmth rather than nihilism. Critics criticized its graphic gore and relentless tone. The box office numbers disappointed Universal Pictures, and Carpenter's momentum slowed. Yet the film's practical creature effects aged remarkably well, influencing generations of horror filmmakers. Home video and cable broadcasts gradually transformed its reputation. What once felt too cold for audiences eventually became celebrated for that very quality. The Thing proved that timing can make or break reception. Financial failure did not erase its artistic legacy.
Blade Runner, 1982. When Ridley Scott released Blade Runner, expectations were high following Alien. Instead of another action-driven thriller, audiences received a slow-burning neo-norm meditation on identity and humanity. Starring Harrison Ford, the film presented rain-soaked dystopia and philosophical ambiguity. Critics were divided, and casual moviegoers found it dense and emotionally distant. Box office returns failed to match its production costs.
Studio-imposed narration and alternate cuts further complicated its legacy. Yet visually, its influence became undeniable, shaping science fiction aesthetics for decades. Multiple director's cuts later, Blade Runner is now considered groundbreaking. In 1982, however, its introspective tone clashed with audience expectations for fast-paced spectacle. Financial disappointment overshadowed innovation. The film's eventual classic status serves as proof that box office numbers rarely tell the full story. Sometimes failure is simply premature appreciation.
The Cotton Club, 1984. Directed by Francis Ford Coppola, The Cotton Club aimed to recreate the glamour and violence of 1930s Harlem nightlife. Lavish sets, musical numbers, and an ensemble cast suggested prestige spectacle. Behind the scenes, production troubles mounted, including budget overruns reportedly climbing beyond $50 million. Marketing struggled to define whether the film was a gangster epic, a musical, or a romance. Critics acknowledged its style, but questioned its narrative focus. Audiences responded cautiously, and ticket sales failed to justify the expense. Coppola's career momentum faltered during this period, and the film became associated with financial strain. Yet its visual recreation of the era remains impressive, and later re-edits attempted to restore the director's vision. At the time, though, ambition outweighed commercial appeal. The Cotton Club dazzled visually, but stumbled financially. Its elegance could not compensate for box office indifference.
The 1980s chased scale like no decade before it. Bigger sets, bigger stars, bigger risks, and sometimes bigger collapses. These films remind us that hype cannot guarantee connection. Timing, tone, and audience expectation matter just as much as budget. Some of these disasters quietly transformed into cult classics. Others remain cautionary tales whispered in studio boardrooms. But every one of them dared to attempt something grand. Failure, in many cases, was simply the cost of ambition. Looking back now, it's easier to appreciate the artistry hidden beneath the headlines. Box office numbers fade, reputation evolves, and occasionally yesterday's flop becomes tomorrow's masterpiece. The 80s were fearless, excessive, and unforgettable. Even their disasters carried spectacle.